to The Art of Thinking about satire, the satire dead, with Andrew Doyle, who is one of the most interesting comedians working today in this country, not just for Jonathan Pie, but also because of his own stand-up and the work that he does in the comedy industry generally. And one of the things that I want to talk about before we have the conversation is the fact that one of the things that makes Andrew so interesting is the fact that his comedy, whether it's stuff he writes or whether it's a stand-up material, it deals with problems that comedy itself is facing right now. So I'm going to talk about what problems comedy itself is facing. Now, the first major problem that comedy is facing today is empathy. Now, you might think, well, how is that a problem for comedy? Well, here's the problem in a nutshell. The more empathetic we are towards human misfortune, towards the downtrodden, towards the disadvantaged, towards the tragedies of human mistakes, the less likely we are to want to see those things as anything other than quite negative things that we should look at with solemnity and respect. And comedy is all about looking at tragedy and misfortune and mistakes and seeing them in a humorous light, looking at them in a light-hearted way, a mocking way often. So in an age like ours, where the zeitgeist seems to be pushing towards getting people more empathetic towards human misfortune and towards the downtrodden, that's also simultaneously going to be an age in which people really clamp down on comedy. Because comedy is about temporarily turning off your empathy so that you can see the lighter side of some form of human tragedy or error or mistake. So an era which is all about expanding people's empathy and encouraging people to expand their empathy is simultaneously going to be an era which encourages people to retract what they're capable of finding funny. And that's also going to be an era which stigmatizes people for laughing at certain jokes. An era in which there's a smaller range of things that comedians can socially acceptably talk about. So that's the major problem. The second problem is there is a distinction between comedy and satire. Now, often comedy and satire go hand in hand. Sometimes they don't. So you can get satires like Orwell's 1984, which are anything but funny. But generally, satire goes hand in hand with comedy because satire is the art of ridiculing something about society that has gone wrong, that needs to be kind of shown up in a no-nonsense way, where you might ruffle some feathers, right? Now, the problem, if you try and do that comedically, is at the moment, trying to ruffle feathers is not something that jives very well with the zeitgeist attitude towards empathy. So, if you want to make people laugh doing comedy, there is a sense today in which it's probably best not to do satire, unless your satire is satire that you know the audience is going to agree with. But then there's another problem. If you're doing satire that you're confident the public agrees with, so let's say if you, in England, satirize Donald Trump, there's the question, well, in what sense is it really satire? Because satire is supposed to ruffle feathers, and satire is supposed to be something that might risk laughs, because there might be some people in the audience who aren't actually going along with the political point that the satire is making. That seems to be the point of satire. So it's not just comedy, but satire itself, which seems quite difficult to pull off today in an age where comedy is being restricted because feathers don't want to be ruffled. Now, the other problem, which has been very much a topic of political discourse that comedy interfaces with, is the problem of censorship, right? So if what's socially unacceptable for comics to say today is the product of a group of activists saying, we don't want to hear gay jokes anymore, we don't want to hear racist jokes, we don't want to hear misogynist jokes, right? That suddenly raised the question, well, is this infringing on the comedian's right to free speech? Or is this actually disadvantaged groups exercising their own freedom of speech, saying that they don't want certain things to be acceptable that were acceptable in the past? And it's kind of easy to say, oh, people should say whatever they want, you know, I don't like political correctness, blah, blah, blah. But what is difficult about taking that position is there's a sense in which you're critiquing the entire civil rights tradition, because the civil rights tradition itself is a tradition about things becoming socially acceptable as society takes more of an interest in the welfare of minorities and disadvantaged groups. I mean, the paragon example of that is it's not socially acceptable in the English-speaking West to use the N-word, right? And if you're going to be completely against political correctness in every fiber of your being, you're going to have to be against that as much as you're going to be against, say, remarks which today people might find examples of cultural appropriation or transphobic or whatever might be offensive today. So, and then that raises the last issue, which is what should we think about the comedy club today? Now, should the comedy club be a kind of, ironically, safe space where you can laugh at things that people out of the comedy club might find mean, that might, be seen as extraordinarily callous to laugh at in daily life? Should the comedy club be a place where you can test how far you can turn off your empathy temporarily to find something funny? And should that be how we look at the comedy club, as a kind of release for our inner child, maybe even our inner bully? So we can get it out of our systems and then go back into our day-to-day lives and be ethical and compassionate. Or should we try and bring the ethics and compassion into the comedy club, even though that's going to a large extent, radically restrict the material of what the comedian says? So these are all of the issues that Andrew's work, both in the work he does with Jonathan Pye and his own stand-up, deals with. And I'm going to talk to Andrew about this work, but first I want to ask him, how did you get involved in comedy? And what sort of inspired you about the idea of doing comedy, period?
Hello. Good question. It is, for me, it was always an instinctive thing. One of my earliest memories is when I'm about the age of 3 or 4, standing on a stage in primary school trying to make people laugh. So it's obviously based in some sort of deep down insecurity somewhere, some flaw, I assume. Why else would you want to do it? I think it's a really bizarre job that I've chosen to do because it's part narcissistic and part sort of self-hating. It's a combination of the two, isn't it? Because you're standing up there and you're desperate for the approval of strangers, but by the same token, it can be you're setting yourself up for humiliation. So it is a peculiar thing, but it was always instinctive. I always wanted to make people laugh.
Is there anything in particular you think that any good comedy should do? Do you think comedy has a certain social function?
I think first and foremost, it should make you laugh. I think that's what it's meant to be about. I think it's a form of entertainment. Of course, as a subsidiary to that, comedy provides the opportunity to critique and comment on social issues, and also to widen people's experiences of what is acceptable to think and feel, and to allow you to look at your own certainties at a different slant, which I think is quite useful.
So you think then comedy can have a very political function?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So when was the first time that you noticed that you were really good at this, and this is something that could be a potential career?
Well, I mean, I think the jury's still out on that one. It depends on who you talk to. I'd say, yeah. I mean, it was while I was at university. I was gigging. I was doing sort of open mic things, and I was in sketch shows. I did lots of comedy acting. I wrote comedy plays, and I was in them. I'm not a very good actor, so they weren't necessarily very successful. And I did a sketch night with 2 other comics in London at a tiny little fringe venue in London, and we hadn't enough material to fill the hour. And so I suggested I might write just some stand-up and give it a go, and that's how I did it. And then that went quite well, so I thought I'd just carry on doing that. So I sort of fell into it in that respect.
So was a lot of your early kind of stand-up material on the comic circuit happening in the noughties?
Yeah, it would have been. Yes, it was. Yes, that's right.
Now this is interesting. So what would you say is the biggest difference between the kind of atmosphere that you started out in comedy in the noughties versus today's atmosphere in the comedy club?
Okay, that's a big question. Humour and comedy ages so quickly, and I think that's something that I think comedians find very depressing. I think Woody Allen made this point that if you want longevity and if you want a legacy, don't go into comedy, go into tragedy, because that'll go on forever. There's literally nothing. I mean, if you take the Shakespearean comedies now, we don't find those jokes funny now, even though a lot of us pretend to. No humour will age particularly well. Because it's dealing with things that are so current, and I've noticed that things have aged very badly. I mean, there was a recent article I read about Friends. I don't know if any of you read this, because it's being reshown on Netflix. And there's a new generation who are seeing this humour, which I perceive to be just yesterday, right? But it isn't. It's quite a long time ago. And there's a new generation who are quite offended by a lot of the material in Friends, which is odd, isn't it? Because Friends, we see it as the most anodyne kind of, like it's fun, it's family fun, but no, it's apparently homophobic and all sorts of things, which I don't think it is. But that's the perception. So sensibilities have changed. But because it's happened so rapidly, I think what's very interesting about this is that the change has been so quick that it's forced comics into a situation where they have to adapt if they want to get the laughs, or if they want to get rebooked, or if they want a chance in their career. And some comics don't feel comfortable because as an art form it's not one that lends itself to just being conformist. I don't think they feel comfortable in going along with what society's prescriptions.
Do you think one of the problems with things like people taking offense at Friends is, in the past when social attitudes changed, because we didn't change in the context of social media, there was a sense that they were changing because the public itself was changing. Whereas now when certain things become socially unacceptable, there's a worry that it's not the public, it's 5 people on the internet.
Absolutely.
Making a ruckus. And because these 5 people kind of scare the public into complying, or create an illusion that there's more than that there really are, there isn't really changes happening about offense that seem like it's coming from the public. It seems like almost the public is being bullied by a minority of activists. Do you find that sentiment something that resonates with you, or do you think it's the public?
I actually think it's probably the media, insofar as, so the Friends is a good example. You're right, it's probably just a handful of people who are offended, but once the BBC reports on that, then that is a news story. And it's taking the outrage of a minority, amplifying it through mainstream media. And we had it this week with Little Mix, didn't we, with the a member of the band Little Mix posted a photo of herself with dreadlocks.
Right.
And then a few activists were angry about that and said it was cultural appropriation. And then the BBC reports that, and it generates this illusion that there is sort of widespread outrage at a completely innocuous act. So it's kind of fabricated. And I think because media platforms do have a political agenda, that's why this will happen. But once they do that, then we have a duty, I think, as comedians and satirists, to mock it. Because it's been amplified, because that means it has become mainstream at that point.
Interesting. So would there be a difference, say, in your response to the general public finding Friends homophobic rather than a group of minority activists?
So you're saying that if it was a majority view that this was an outrageous, offensive thing?
Yeah, would that change how you react to the offence then?
Well, for me, if you're in the creative industry, if you're creating something artistically, well, my last concern would be about whether people are upset by it or not. That would never be my intention, but if people do take offence, that's their choice. I think it's something. It's really quite straightforward for me. If you find something offensive, then you have the choice not to watch that piece of work. That's it. I don't think once you start saying, well, let's legislate or let's create these parameters within which the artist can work, that's creeping towards, it isn't quite, but it's creeping towards a form of authoritarianism, which I'm very uncomfortable with.
Okay, so what would you say to the objection to that, which often is given by activists who say that if we let artists and comedians and the media industry do whatever they want, then we're going to perpetuate inequalities and stereotypes and various disadvantages that minorities are going to face. And if anything, the artist should be showing solidarities with the minorities and the oppressed rather than saying we should be able to do whatever we want, whatever the consequence might be for this or that minority. How would you respond to that objection?
I would say the artist has no moral responsibility whatsoever. The role of the artist is not to be your moral guardian at all. Oscar Wilde says this in the preface to Picture of Dorian Gray. He says there's no such thing as a moral book or an immoral book. Books are badly written or well written, that is all. And I think that's exactly what it is. This entire idea that if you tell certain jokes or if you represent things artistically, that it will have a kind of trickle-down effect and the public will suddenly start being homophobic and racist, etc., and behaving in that way, mimicking that. It's called media effects theory. The idea that mass media has an effect on the public behaviour at large. Now, there's been 6 decades of research into this concept, and so far there has not been any evidence emerging that suggests that this is the case. You can always find a polarised study that says it is, or one that says it definitely isn't. But the consensus is, in the people who've been studying this, the experts in this, there is no consensus on this, there is no evidence for this. But now it's accepted as an article of faith. So therefore you'll have a situation where, one example would be the Dapper Laughs case, right, where he was accused of perpetuating rape culture through jokes, and the implication of that is, well, if he tells this joke, suddenly all those members in the audience are going to go out and perform criminal acts, right? So that's a very degraded view of humanity, for one thing. But it's also based on a perception that the audience are these sort of mindless drones. And particularly in that case, because his audience are predominantly working class, I think we didn't get these complaints, say, when Jimmy Carr or people who had more middle-class audiences were joking about the same topics. I think there's this sense in which, well, of course, working-class people, they'll just go out and behave like that. And my point is that, well, okay, maybe there's an argument there. Maybe there's something in media effects theory. Maybe we do modify our behaviour on the basis of entertainment. But if so, I'd like to see some evidence for it before I accept it, and there is none.
Okay, so on that note, suppose, for instance, now I take it for granted that you believe that your own comedy is not homophobic, racist, sexist, etc., right? Yeah,
well, I'm not a homophobic, racist, sexist person. So,
okay.
I mean, I've been accused of being homophobic.
Mm-hmm. But you can imagine a comedian who you think is those things.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, yeah, of course.
Okay.
It's perfectly possible, yeah.
So,
well, I mean, Bernard Manning admitted to being racist
okay,
in an interview with Mrs. Merton. He admitted it.
Okay, so let's take a Bernard Manning type comedian. Maybe imagine a comedian that's even worse than that.
Okay.
So, suppose a comedian goes on stage and tells jokes to the effect that, let's say, people of my skin color, Mexican Americans who live in England, are lazy, stupid, ugly rapists, and the crowd is howling at it. And that's on BBC One or BBC Two at 8 o'clock at night, and loads of children with my skin color, teenagers, young adults are watching this audience of people laugh at this comedian talking about how Mexican Americans who live in England are horrible rapists and thieves and lazy people and whatever else the stereotypes are. Because of your rejection of media effects theory, would you be okay with that?
That's a good question. Probably not, but for different reasons. Because I think if you are that sort of act, firstly, you're probably not very good from the sound of things. Mm-hmm. It doesn't sound particularly nuanced or interesting, and I think there has to be some quality control on the BBC. I know sometimes it looks like there isn't, but you know, I'd like to think that there should be. And that, to me, sounds like the kind of act that is really just generating a response out of endorsement for a certain viewpoint, mm-hmm, rather than a successful comedic act. So that would be my objection to it on those grounds, on grounds of quality.
So on grounds of quality, you wouldn't like that kind of act. But if there was...
But it's also a fringe act. I mean, what you're describing there is... the BBC doesn't put fringe acts on. Okay. It doesn't put like a performance artist like David Hoyle on at 8 o'clock. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that David Hoyle isn't a brilliant act, because he is a brilliant act. But that doesn't have mainstream appeal. And because the vast majority of people aren't racist, sexist, bigots, that doesn't have that kind of appeal. So I wouldn't expect it to be. If it was on some really sort of bizarre, like Sky, some sort of internet channel late at night or whatever, mm-hmm, fine. I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I would just choose not to watch it, and I would urge others to do the same. So that would be my argument.
So, but do you think, though, legally speaking at least, there should be a place in the world for racist comedy and an audience laughing at it?
Well, I don't believe in hate speech as a concept. I think people should be able to say whatever they want, and that's the best way to defeat racism, is to know who the racists are, so that they have freedom to say this, because then you can say, okay, well, that's what they think. I don't want to associate with that kind of person. Or better still, I want to explain to you why you're wrong. Or better still, look at what this person is saying. Let's talk about why this person is wrong. That's how you defeat bad ideas. Otherwise, you grant these kind of people a kind of weird glamour, a weird kind of martyrdom, which they absolutely don't deserve, and it generates a lot of resentment. And particularly at the moment, where there seems to be a real drive to try and broaden these concepts. So that homophobia can mean hatred of gay people, or it can mean a comedian who tells a joke about gay culture, who is not homophobic but is perceived to be homophobic, and suddenly they're a bigot. So these things widen and widen, and then we say, well, we have to silence everyone who does that. And that, I think, is extremely dangerous and naive.
Interesting. At the moment, one of the issues that impacts comedy is it seems like there's a fight over defining what is homophobic. So on kind of one extreme, you'll see comments that most people would say are not homophobic being defined as homophobic. Even comments to the effect that I have a heterosexual sexual orientation. Some activists might find homophobic because they think that heterosexuality is itself a kind of bigotry. That's on the extreme.
Well, then they're idiots.
Yeah, and then there are people who want to say incredibly things that most of us would consider homophobic, and they would consider those things not homophobic. So how do we decide what's homophobic and what isn't?
Well, it's very complicated because you can't intuit people's private motives, can you? What I'd like to think in terms of comedy is that you give the performer the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I don't know any homophobic comics. I don't know any, and I'm on the comedy circuit, and I know most of them. We're quite a community, and so I wouldn't assume, if I see a comic making a joke that is ostensibly homophobic, I try and think, what are they trying to do there? They're probably trying to do something a bit more sophisticated than you assume. And that's always the case. Very rarely will you have a comic just stand up and try and propagate anti-gay sentiment. It just really won't happen. Because those people are few and far between. I mean, if you could name me one, I'd be really interested, but I don't know them. I don't know of them. Someone like Bernard Manning is a good example. So because he's open about, he admitted to being a racist, and that makes you suspect his acts a bit. You don't watch his act and thinking, oh, he's playing with slippery ideas of acceptability and parameters, and you know that he's not, because he says he's not explicitly. So that's I'd say just give comics the benefit of the doubt. A lot of this is about misinterpretation. I think sometimes it's the comic's fault, insofar as maybe the comedian hasn't made their stance clear through the performance, and that's a flaw in the performance. But it shouldn't be a punishable crime. It should be, well, that's back to the drawing board, and now how do I find a way to tackle this difficult issue so that my intention is clear, but it's also funny. It's really difficult. I mean, comedians really should be allowed to fail, and should be allowed to go for these sensitive areas and not always get it right, because it's easy not to get it right. You know.
Okay, so when you perform a joke that has a political message that you think is important, let's say you do a pro-Brexit joke, for instance, and then you notice the audience, which was previously laughing, goes completely quiet. If that happens, would you take that as a signal that, you should only do anti-Brexit jokes or not talk about it, or would you take that as a signal, I've got to find a way to make this funny even to people who hate Brexit?
Right, so that's a really good example. That is a situation where people in the audience are laughing because they agree with you. And I always try to resist that. It happens sometimes, and it's certainly on the Jonathan Pye tour, because I'm doing the opening support act, and of course I've got a number of jokes about Theresa May, say, and of course they can get a cheer because the people hate Theresa May, and that makes me think, okay, but was the joke actually good enough to elicit that response? Would that joke work in a room full of Tory supporters? And if it would, then I would say it's a good, worthwhile joke. But I'd say that, I mean, for me personally, when I go and see comedy, I don't want to have my existing views just thrown back at me. I find that very boring. I'd rather be seeing someone who's presenting views that even annoy me. I find that great. I find that quite exciting. And so that's what I strive to do. One thing I strive to do in stand-up is not be clear about what my position is sometimes, to make people think, God, does he really believe that? Often I say things that I don't believe, because stand-up is a theatrical thing. You are playing a persona. Very few stand-ups are just themselves on stage. In fact, I'd say maybe a handful, one or two. It is a complete persona, it's a theatrical role. So, I would suggest that with Brexit, I did a show 2 years ago at the Edinburgh Fringe, just after the Brexit vote, where I did a very pro-Brexit bit, and it did tend to shut people up, even though I thought it was quite a good joke. And so I had to find a better way to make that work. And I had to change the material, not because I'm afraid of expressing the viewpoint, but because, well, it's not eliciting the laughter anymore, so let's see if I can make the same point, but make them laugh in spite of what they believe. That's the challenge, isn't it, I think?
Do you ever worry that in order to get the maximum amount of laughs, you have to kind of dull down your comedic personality?
Oh, yeah. Oh, terrible. I did a corporate gig to a group of bouncers in Leeds, can you imagine? And of course we do these corporate gigs because they pay really well, they pay much better than clubs. You have to prostitute yourself, essentially. It's a horrible gig, no one likes doing it. And they were all drunk, just bouncers drunk, and they were just shouting, you know, it's just nonsense. And I dumbed down totally. I did all my lowest common denominator jokes because I just wanted to get out of there alive. I just wanted to do my stage time. But the distinction is, I would say, well, that's not an artistic enterprise for me. That's just a day at the office. I just want to get my laughs, get my money, and go. And you have to do the stage time in order to get the money, even if no one's listening. Whereas if I'm doing an Edinburgh show, like say I'm doing an hour-long show, or if I'm doing a club that gives you a long set where you can sort of play with ideas, then that is when I consider that the more kind of, it's a different job actually. That's where sounds really pretentious, that's where the art of it comes in. It does sound pretentious because stand-up comedy purports not to be artistic. And I can say this now because I'm not in my comedic role, but I do consider it an art form.
Do you ever have a problem where you find yourself having to justify a joke by kind of explaining, no, this is not a racist joke, this is not a homophobic joke, and in the process of explaining, you might convince the person who took issue with it, but the whole humor of it just got completely obliterated because it became about justifying the joke rather than making people laugh?
Well, you wouldn't do that on stage, would you? Because if you deconstruct a joke on stage, well, some people do deconstruct jokes for humorous effect, but it kills it. If you analyse a joke, it kills it. That's why my instinct, if someone has taken offence at someone I've said, and made an assumption, my instinct is to go even further and actually enact the assumption that they think. I think that's far more interesting than trying to backtrack. So, for instance, I made a joke about Theresa May's appearance in Edinburgh. Someone shouted out that I was a misogynist, and then I did explain. I did point out that she's taking what I'm saying at face value, and how taking what a comedian says at face value is always a disaster. And then I deliberately enacted I could say, if you want me to be misogynistic, I will, and said some misogynistic things. And the point of that is, well, I wasn't actually being misogynistic before, but you perceived it anyway, so I may as well be. And yet I'm not a misogynist. So I think that's a more interesting way of dealing with it.
Yeah. And did that get a laugh?
Yeah. Not from her. But it actually got a very good reaction. It sort of really helped the show.
Yeah, well, for those of you in the audience who want to do stand-up comedy, that's actually a perfect example of how to deal with a heckler and still make it funny, is to make fun of the heckler in a way where you can get the other members of the audience to laugh.
Yeah. Oh yes, I mean, if you're having a really bad gig and no one's laughing, and someone heckles you, it'll be really hard. You've got to have the support of the audience, I think.
Right. Now, one of the interesting jokes that you do, one of your routines, I'm not going to repeat it because other people might come and see you and I want them to hear it, but one of the things that you joke about is how you think a lot of the censoriousness and the you can't say that culture is really coming from people in the middle classes. And there's a kind of implicit worry about people in the working classes or in the poor, that's where the kind of fascism and racism and misogyny in society is coming from. It's not coming from educated people. It's coming from sort of the lower orders, which is a very strange social phenomenon, because supposedly, like if you're on the left, which these middle-class people are, you want to help the poor, but there seems to be within the middle classes a fear of the poor that you tap into in a lot of your routines. When did you start noticing this?
I think this gets to the heart of where the left have gone astray, actually. Because from my perspective, in order to be left-wing, you have to be class-conscious, and you have to be aware of the realities of economic inequality, and you have to strive to redress that. Because the left, I believe, has been hijacked by what I would call the liberal left, which is not the same as the left, and I call them the liberal left, maybe identitarians. People who are so obsessed with race, gender, sexuality, these sort of intersectional grievances. Now, that would be one thing. That would be fine if they were also addressing class issues. This is often used, though, as a smokescreen to avoid thinking about class entirely, and to avoid thinking about money. For instance, I mean, do you really think that if Hillary Clinton had been elected, that a working class woman in America who's working 2 jobs, who can't feed her kids, and that would persist during Clinton's tenure, but that she would feel consoled that there is a female millionaire in the White House? Probably not. Did black people under Obama have their lot, working class black people have their lot improved under Obama actually know the reverse? Do you think they're consoled by the fact that there's a rich black guy in the White House? No. Right, so it's a distraction, and it's a very middle class bourgeois distraction. The other thing is, of course, it doesn't cost you anything. So you can push for minorities and gay rights and all the rest of it, which we all agree should be there. But then you don't have to do any more, because that's where the virtue lies. You appear virtuous by doing that, so you don't have to address all those other things. That's my perception of this, and I think it's a real worry. I think Labour in particular has been infected with this. I mean, this week we had the Young Labour conference saying you could only attend if you were a BAME person or LGBT person, and if you were a straight white male, you're excluded. Now, to be honest, no one cares. I mean, there's no one who's saying, "Oh, I wish I could have gone to that," and I can't. Like, no one actually cares. But what that does do is for a start, it gives the right the opportunity to manipulate this and say, look at these exclusionary people, look at what they're doing. And you had all these right-wing papers obviously jumping on it, saying, look at how terrible these are. So you've given a gift to your opponents, and you're generating a lot of resentment from people who are saying, well, I'm straight white male, but I'm not racist, I'm not bigoted, why are you assuming that? And I think it's not the way to win. I mean, we know that identity politics loses elections. It does. Hillary Clinton obsessively, repeatedly targeted people based on ethnicity or sexuality, saying, "Oh, look out for you." Or look at that's dividing people up. As a politician, if you want to win, you have to be talking to everyone, and you have to be talking to everyone as equals. So that's where I think the left is going wrong. And I don't consider this contentious, but I know that people do think this is contentious, and I'm not sure why. But there we go.
What would you say about people who on the left would say, well, actually, Andrew, given everything you've just said, and given how the left has changed in the last 5 years, you are the right. You're who we're fighting against. You might as well be a Tory.
Yeah.
Because as far as we're concerned, you're on that side of the political spectrum. How would you respond to that?
That's because they don't read. So they don't know what left and right means anymore. They think being on the left is putting up a gay flag on your Facebook profile. Right? It's not. They don't know what it means. I mean, now, it's also very complex, of course, isn't it? That we've got to a position now where, because so many of the voices calling for censorship are self-identifying as left, then when people mention free speech, they're also, if you defend free speech, indivisible free speech for everybody, particularly the people you hate, you're assumed to be right-wing. I mean, the comedy night I set up in London, Comedy Unleashed, was advertised as a free speech night, and what we meant by that is simply that we would encourage comics not to self-censor and just to try things out and say what they think. And then the Sunday Telegraph wrote an article saying it's great, we've got a right-wing comedy night. So they saw free speech and said right-wing. Now it's run by two left-wingers. I don't know how they've made that connection. But that's a worry to me, that the left has lost the free speech argument. It should be enshrined in what we do. And yet, of course, it's people on the right who are pushing for free speech, because they're the ones, because they lost the cultural war. They're the ones who are being silenced. So then it becomes sort of irrevocably associated with them. And the other problem you have is I think left and right is complex, because if you go onto the political compass, the online, it'll assess where you are politically. Of course, it's no longer left and right, is it? They very wisely have left and right and authoritarian and anarchic. And you end up with a kind of a four-way thing, which is... No, I didn't mean that. But like a four-way plotting point. And I would end up there on the libertarian left, I suppose. I think.
Okay. Do you have a problem with the fact that, because of what you've been describing, there is a sense that the place in the political spectrum you go to talk about free speech is the right? So, for instance, one thing that many left-wing critics have been saying is that when someone like Lindsay Shepherd or Nicholas Christakis, people who have been kind of hounded by the politically correct left, when they complain about it, even though they're left-wing themselves, they don't go to left-wing outlets to complain about the lack of free speech. They go on Joe Rogan, or they talk to Jordan Peterson, or they talk to people that are associated with the right.
Yeah.
Do you have a problem with the fact that, given the kind of work that you do, there are going to be probably right-leaning outlets that want to make alliances with you and talk to you rather than left-wing ones? given the political climate we have today?
Well, firstly, I think dialogue is really important, so I don't have any problem whatsoever with using those sorts of platforms. In fact, in some ways that's better, so you get a dissenting voice on that platform. The other problem we have is that liberal left publications are often the most narrow-minded and won't give you that platform anyway. So, for instance, when we started Comedy Unleashed, we got a lot of press attention from the Times, Telegraph. The Daily Mail approached us. Guardian wouldn't come near it, okay? Because it's a free speech thing, and they perceive that. Well, I don't know why, or maybe they just had better things to do. Probably, yeah. But no, that problem was raised after Tom Walker, who plays Jonathan Pye and created Jonathan Pye. We wrote a video about Donald Trump after the election, which was the biggest video we've had, and Breitbart picked it up and published a transcript of it approvingly. That Breitbart is associated with the alt-right in many people's minds.
How do you feel about that?
I didn't like it at the time. I'll be honest, my reaction was not. I wasn't happy. I was a bit shocked, actually, because we were advancing a left-wing idea and even overtly bashing Trump. But because the thrust of the video was saying, this is why we lost, it's because Hillary was a terrible candidate, and this is why we lost, and we need to ditch, and because of identity politics, we need to ditch this, we need to find a new approach. That was the argument. But it resonated with a lot of right-wingers, particularly in America. There was a website called Chicks on the Right that published a really approving piece on it. And it's curious, isn't it? But I don't have a problem with those platforms. You talk where you can talk, when people will let you talk.
Do you think that because of the left being so narrow-minded as you described it, it's created a strange situation where actually the right is becoming more open to left-wing ideas? Like there are libertarians, for instance, who take the idea of a basic income for all citizens seriously, and Donald Trump worries about the impact of globalization on your average working person. So do you think that actually the right today is big enough to potentially include something like you in a way where you wouldn't necessarily bristle at the idea of being part of it?
Well, I would say it goes back to this idea that I think left and right aren't rigid things necessarily, and we've all got something we can learn from people who think differently from us. And I think if you do subscribe wholeheartedly to an ideology, you are by definition subscribing to a method of simplifying the world. So if you say, well, I am a libertarian, then you can only think within those parameters. But maybe a couple of the ideas on the right or the left are good for you, and you can sort of pick and choose, because there's room for nuance, there's room for debate. That is, I think, the problem is that people pigeonhole you and say, oh, well, you're just a right-winger. And what they really mean is, well, now I don't have to talk to you. Now I don't have to listen to your ideas. Well, that's not helpful. I write regularly for an online magazine called Spiked, which is a left-wing radical humanist magazine. But because it is pro-free speech and against identity politics, I see it online often referred to as the alt-right. In fact, The Guardian referred to Spiked writers as handmaidens of the alt-right. So I'm now a handmaiden of the alt-right. And that is just a strategy. It means I don't need to talk about what you're saying. I don't need to address the issues that you're saying. It would be very interesting if Spiked were alt-right, given that it was consistently anti-Donald Trump, anti-racism, pro-immigration. If it was an alt-right site, it's doing something very wrong. It's not very effective. So that is, I think, the labels of left and right then become just a strategy to avoid debate. And I think that's a problem. Okay,
so what would you say about somebody who is kind of ostensibly on the left, who really hates, a magazine like the Daily Mail, but they see that the Daily Mail gives you a really positive review, and they think, okay, well, if the Daily Mail likes Andrew Doyle, maybe I should start reading the Daily Mail now. Would you be okay with that?
I do sometimes read the Daily Mail.
Okay.
I try to read a breadth of perspectives. But I wouldn't just assume because of one good review that I therefore like the publication. That'd be quite narcissistic, wouldn't it?
Right.
And also, of course, each publication it has multiple writers with different thoughts. I do it myself. I often say, "Oh, the Guardian thinks this." Well, the Guardian doesn't think anything. There's various writers for the Guardian who actually sometimes have different opinions. I oversimplify it for comedic effect, just because I find it hilarious that the Guardian purports to be left-wing. Well, I don't think I've ever read a left-wing article in The Guardian. It's centrist. It's overtly Blairite centrist. It costs £2 a day. That's not a working-class paper, is it? But I do caricature it when I make jokes about it. But yeah, so yeah, I'd love a great review from the Daily Mail. It'd be great.
Okay. Now, one of the pieces that you've actually written for Spiked is a piece about an incident that happened, I believe, 1.5 years ago. There was an internet comedian in Scotland who goes by the name of Count Degula. His real name is
Marcus Meekin.
Yeah, Marcus Meekin. And he made a online vlog which was sort of documenting an elaborate joke he was playing on his girlfriend, where in order to annoy her, he trained her dog to react enthusiastically to Hitler videos, and specifically phrases like Sieg Heil and, more disturbingly, Gas the Jews, when Gas the Jews was stated in an enthusiastic voice pitch. And what you wrote about was that actually this man was essentially arrested for this. And can you tell us a bit about this story? Because I think it's quite important in terms of everything else you've been saying.
I think this is a really crucial story in this. I mean, we've had a couple of moments where governments have tried to intervene with comedians, most notably Mike Ward, a comedian in Canada, who was fined $42,000 for a joke he told by the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, I think it is. Found guilty, $42,000. And that, I think, is very, very disturbing. Canada's a bit nuts about this sort of stuff, though. You know, it's very troubling over there. What troubles me about this, we've had a few people serve jail time in the UK for jokes. You probably don't know about it. They're normally teenagers, normally working class unemployed teenagers who've posted a bad taste joke on Facebook. And I'm talking actual jail time. Doesn't get much coverage, but it has happened. I think that is that's certainly authoritarianism. I mean, we should have all been outraged about that. And that is not to say that I support the joke or think that they weren't funny. And I would also say, yes, that's probably offensive and poor taste, but I think once you're imprisoning anyone for a joke, that you've gone way too far. But the Crown Prosecution Service in Scotland has thought it wise to take this man to court, Marcus Meekin, for what is overtly a comedic video. There's no doubt about it. Whether you find it funny or not is besides the point. You know, that can't be the benchmark of whether something's acceptable or not, whether you find it funny. For one thing, everyone has a different sense of humour. Also, if I get a bad review, do I have to then do community service, right? That cannot be the limit. When he made this video, for a start, it's a Nazi pug. That's already funny, yes? It's right, if he's serious... Now, the prosecutor, you can actually read some of the statements, because this has been going... It's still going on. The state is filibustering. It's been going on and on.
Yeah, they haven't decided yet what his sentence is going to be.
They keep delaying. Now, I'd like to think that almost certainly he's going to be found not guilty and common sense will prevail. I'm sure that is the case. But the fact that he's been on trial now for, what is it, 1.5 years or something? I mean, it's already an outrage. And you can read some of the transcripts that have come out, and the prosecutor is saying things like, you are using the guise of humour to propagate anti-Semitic hatred. Right? That's what they actually are saying. Now, if he was really trying to spread the tenets of neo-Nazism, there would be better mediums than pugs, I would suggest. What's worse about this is that at the start of the video, he says, I'm trying to annoy my girlfriend, so I've decided to turn her cute wee dog into the most disgusting thing I can think of, a Nazi. So he's explained the joke, which comedians should never do. But he's done it, he's explained it for you. It's there in black and white. He didn't have to, but he did it. And then every time he says Sieg Heil, the pup does that with its paw. So you're laughing already. You haven't seen it, but you're laughing. So anyone who hasn't been lobotomized knows that this is humorous, right? But the prosecutors are genuinely saying this. So there's one of two things going on there. Either the Crown Prosecution Service in Scotland genuinely believes this is anti-Semitic hatred, in which case they shouldn't be doing it in those jobs. That's terrifying, because that's amoeba-level stupidity. Or they know that it was meant to be a joke and they're prosecuting for different reasons, and in that case it's a sinister situation. So either way, this is not a good... I mean, I think it will be a landmark case. Either way, I mean, can you imagine if he was sent to jail for this? it will be huge.
Well, he believes he's going to be sent to jail. He's made statements to that effect recently.
I can't see it happening. I'm sure at some point the state will put a stop to this. Surely? I mean, am I just being hopelessly optimistic? I can't see it. But it's already a massive violation on his civil liberties. I get offended by lots of things. I'm quite a sensitive person, but I would just not watch it. That's my solution. I think this is really, really frightening.
So, do you think that the prosecution fundamentally rests on a misunderstanding of what he was trying to do?
It can't, because they're intelligent people.
Okay.
How could you misunderstand that when he explains it? I can't believe that the prosecutors are that stupid. I doubt.
Well, do you think that this is fundamentally just a case of media effects theory in practice? I mean, the idea is that if you make jokes about Nazis, then you will be, in some sense, making people in the public Nazis?
Okay, well, that's another way of looking at it. So maybe there's a sincerity to the prosecution, and what they believe is that this will create Nazis. When a young, impressionable person sees a dog move in a certain way and watch a Hitler video, that they'll be attracted to Mein Kampf. Okay, so if that's your view, right? But I'd like to see some evidence for that, because I think that would be hard to prove.
Okay, so, I mean, another comment that people who support the prosecution have said, and this is a word that gets bandied around a lot today, is even if it's not funny, even if it wasn't intended to promote Nazism, it's still normalizing anti-Semitic rhetoric. What do you think is meant by normalize?
I don't understand that. A joke does the reverse, because a joke mocks. I promise you, neo-Nazis are not going to thank him for this video, because it makes Hitler and the whole Nazi thing look it ridicules. I mean, the target here is Nazism. I mean, so I don't understand how a joke can normalise. I really take issue with that.
Okay. What about the idea that, sure, if you're an intelligent person, then you'll see this and you'll think it doesn't make Nazism look in any way attractive. But if you're a thick person, the worry is that you'll see this sort of thing and think, oh, maybe Nazism isn't so bad because look, there's a joke about it. How would you respond to that worry?
So it is unfeasible to police art and comedy on the basis of what the stupid people will think, or how stupid people might interpret it. I mean, if we did that, can you imagine what our culture would be like? You know, we'd have no art, would we? Everything would have to be very, very basic, no nuance, nothing. And also, I don't think humanity. I give humanity a bit more credit than that, personally.
That's a really interesting idea, because it seems to suggest that the reason why we have the level of diversity and freedom and thought provocation in our culture that we take for granted, is because we're willing to risk stupid people misinterpreting it and doing horrible things in its name.
That's the price you pay, isn't it? I think. It's, you know, I mean, the price you pay for a free society where we can all say and think what we want is that some people are going to say and think things that we find very, very unpleasant. I think that is a price really worth paying.
That's very interesting. And on that note...
Andrew, to The Observer,
yes.
A YouTube comedian
yes.
has crossed a line.
So a man in Scotland is a YouTube comedian called Marcus Meakin, and he made a YouTube video 2 years ago now, which has caused great offence. He trained his girlfriend's pug to do a Nazi salute and to respond to phrases like Sieg Heil, and he's now actually been found guilty in a court in a Scottish court for breaching the Electronic Communications Act on the grounds that it is grossly offensive. Now, a lot of the debates that are going on about this are based around the idea of, well, is it funny? Is it not funny? Is it offensive? Is it not offensive? Well, that depends very much who you talk to, because humour is so subjective. What is very clear, I think that misses the point, because actually the point is that the state has absolutely no business locking civilians away for things they say or for things they think, and that really should be, and especially if it's something that you don't agree with or don't like. I think that's what we should be talking about.
But the fact that it's published, then that takes it into a different realm, doesn't it? Because it's no longer a personal view when you shared it, as he has done, because he's a YouTube comedian.
Yes.
That takes it into another realm.
Yes, but the criteria seems to be that if it causes offence, then he should be criminalised, that offence is the priority. Now, that's a problem, because the court actually ruled, and they said that context is irrelevant irrelevant and intention is irrelevant. Now, if you watch the video, it's absolutely 100% clear, whether you find it funny or not, the intention was to be funny. If you take context and intent away from this, then comedians aren't safe to make jokes. And I understand the reticence, because a lot of people who are perceived as far right, people like Tommy Robinson, have come out to defend this man. So people don't want to be aligned with those sorts of people. I totally understand that. The problem is that those people don't get to own this principle. People like Tommy Robinson don't get to own the principle of freedom of speech. This is not to do with left or to do with right. The left in particular has to own this, has to get back on track and say, no, freedom of speech is something that is essential to any democratic society, and we need to protect it, even for people who say things that upset us.